It looks like we had a little bit of a glitch. We're gonna wait for Doc to come back in. Um, in the meantime, I think that I saw some questions in the chat. Let me see if I can open them. It doesn't look like it. Um, we were in the middle of a talk about system change. Um, and while we wait for them to come back in, I just want to say a couple of more, points about the convergence of this moment. Um, 2020 has brought to light lots of new conversations about.
Back.
Oh, Doc is back. I was just about to do my TED talk.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it's
Down
good.
here, we get a lot of rain down here. That hurricane is.
I don't even
But
think it's on you. I think that was the host.
oh, okay.
I mean, what happens when we start getting real, you know what I'm saying? CIA chimes in and it was like, nah, they going in a direction, they about to start healing for real. We can't let this happen. But we persevere. Um, but I think you were in the middle of a sentence when we got cut. You were talking
Well,
about.
I, as I said, I think people realize I started getting rejuvenated when I have people come and say they're looking for a black male psychiatrist because they want somebody they can relate to their beginning and their middle and possibly where they're headed.
Sure.
To have like experiences or come from a background that's similar to people is it helps a great deal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So,
And that's why having therapists because somebody that can listen and understand, not
yeah.
listen and judge. And
Mm-hmm,
I tell people all the time. I tell the people that I work with that do the therapy. You know, there are four things that we want to do. One is avoid stigma. There's stigma associated with getting help. Two, keep things simple. Three,
mm-hmm,
don't judge, just help. You know,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
people would tell you everything as long as they don't feel that you're looking at them in a judgmental manner. If you know, I tell them, I said, I'm not here to judge you. I'm just here to listen and help you with whatever you feel that you need help with.
True.
And the fourth thing, if you don't know, you need to refer them to somebody who does know. Uh,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
that's simple things to do when you're dealing with complex problems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, I've got a lot of therapist friends that have their capacity just at their max, personally and emotionally, but also just because they got a waiting list. And so, in this moment, when people are seeking more therapy and are more open to mental health services, but the system has not created enough therapists and providers, and there's an access problem, I'm wondering what are some things that we can leave people with that could be tips or tools or resources they can use without going into an office. And let's say you call somebody, but then it takes weeks for them to get back to you. What are some, to your point about simple, what are some simple things that people can do to start to prepare themselves for what I'm really nervous about is going to be a dark season for Black people this fall, this winter, the convergence of these overlapping pandemics. In Chicago, they've expressed themselves through a lot of gun violence, particularly of children. And I think that explosion of trauma, as is manifested in that way through the looting and all the other stuff that's happened outwardly, I'm nervous is going to turn inward and it's going to implode. And these numbers we're seeing around addiction, intimate partner violence, suicide, I think the depression, anxiety, I think this is going to get worse, not better, unless we intervene, unless there's something different that happens. Like the patterns are suggesting increased problems along the way. And I think that when the sun goes down and it's cold again and when we're even more isolated, um, the exacerbated problems of the e-learning across the country, are just making so much more stress and trauma for everybody. Um, and the solution, therapy is good and it's helpful, but when people can't get to a therapist, when they can't get to a psychiatrist as good as you are, what is it that people can do at home in their families? What are the practices that we need to start to implement now in advance of things getting worse as things get darker?
Well, what I've tried to do, and what I've started doing with Kappa Alpha Fraternity, is I made it known when I was given this directive by the Grand Pomar, Reuben Shelton. I made it known that I want brothers to hold each other accountable. I am my brother's keeper, is what I tell them all the time. And part of being my brother's keeper is educating. I want brothers to recognize when they notice changes that may suggest that somebody is perhaps having a hard time. And in educating, we start giving out basic information, even all the way down to undergraduate brothers in college, on how to recognize when somebody around you that you have regular dealings with may be changing or may be involved in something that they're not saying. And I tell them to get the three basic things. There's feelings involved, there's thoughts, there's physical effects, and there's beliefs. When you look at feelings, you're dealing with all of a sudden there are changes, and you notice rage, anger, irritability. You also notice resentment, anxiety, fear, despair, hopelessness, numbness, guilt, sadness, helplessness, and loss of control, disinterest in things that they were previously interested in, and a feeling of being overwhelmed. If you start noticing those feelings, then there might be a need to get somebody and start talking to them and suggesting maybe you need to seek some help.
So here's what's hard about that, though, and I appreciate that list. Like, as emotional intelligence, having the language to experience the multiple things that are happening inside of our bodies, there's a lot of power in that. What I'm concerned about is how that bumps into how men are socialized, because the older we get, the better we get at masking all of that. So we could experience all those things you mentioned, but on the outside, be presenting everything's cool, just chilling, like just another day. We have these rote responses to how you doing, and it could be a brother to brother, a wife to husband, a son, mother to son. Like, it could be a genuine reaching out to, how you doing? Like, are you doing okay? But we have just practiced posturing, doing okay so well that we can convince ourselves, but certainly other people. So that accountability part is hard. If you got somebody silently suffering, how do you break through that? How do we as men change what masculinity is about so that what you're talking about doesn't come off as weak or vulnerable, or we even talk about when you cry, you're getting in touch with your feminine side. The concept of that sounds like I got to go out of my masculine and become more feminine in order to become more emotional. Like the foundation of the system is broken, and I don't know. Yeah, as a part of fraternity, having access to groups of men around the country, what are the things that can happen to make those shifts in the concept of what a man is and does, that includes the honest, open, vulnerable, what I'm saying, just human emotional experiences that you're describing?
Well, and you're absolutely correct. Talking about men in particular, like you said, there's a need to not show any weakness and to be the alpha person in the household, alpha person in the group, and that does sometimes present a problem. However, men are also thought to be quote unquote reasonable and able to deal with logic. Some are. There are a lot that are not, but I tell them all the time, keep it simple. Okay. And when you keep things simple, you're basically letting somebody know that, hey, I just noticed something. I'm not trying to get in your business. I know you got it all taken care of everything, but if this affects you and affects you being able to, whatever you're trying to do, make money, go to work, go to school, do whatever, then that's affecting who you are in the long run.
Okay.
You know, sometimes our short-term goals with individuals is to make them think about something, not change something. Think about something. They may do it on their time, they may do it on your time, but you generally, if you just let them know, and sometimes you got to let them off the hook by also suggesting, you know, by educating you, let them know that sometimes you have to notice they would rather talk to someone else or talk about somebody else rather than themselves. You know, you can give them a third person that they don't have to deal with in terms of this. You know, say, well, you know, so I noticed a few people that were having some difficulty coping with the death of a friend, and I noticed they were becoming more irritable, and they were not able to focus as well as they want to, and all of a sudden they you know, they would start having problems at work and everything.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The person that you're talking to, where you're giving him an indirect message, in his mind he's saying, well, you know, I noticed that about them too. What did you think they should do? And you just gotta you lead them down the path that they want to follow, and if they want to get on the path and that's directly involving themselves, they will.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is free will, and you know, I try to educate them to the point where they recognize that, okay, I've gone as far as I can go with this. I need some help.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so part of the help, again, part of what I want to get at is what does that look like for Black people? And in 2020, that might sometimes diverge from our training and the institutions that we do the work in. As a community mental health person, what does it look like in community in rural Black America, right? One of the things that I appreciate about when I would go down south to my family, you know, in Chicago, we got folks in Mississippi and Alabama. We would go down there, and there was a brilliance about Black folks that were still closer to the land than disconnected. They were, you know, a city folk. Like I couldn't grow a tomato. You know what I'm saying? It would take me, you know, part of it is having the infrastructure in the land and the good fertilized dirt to do that in. But part of it is just being disconnected from those rituals, those, you know what I'm saying, those simple but like complex but like essential life principles that you get from cultivating land. From, you know what I'm saying, you know, my uncle used to raise his own chickens in the house. You know what I'm saying? Like, is right now when I had a moment of frantic when the tissue was, you know, I couldn't find toilet paper in the grocery store. I started to immediately think, well, what if that happens with food? Like, what am I gonna do if that happens with food? For the first time this year, I was thinking about having to protect the food in my house. I'm not a gun guy, but I started thinking about having to buy a gun in the house. I got boys, I got children. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, what happens if this turns into the purge? Because I right now don't have the skill sets to feed my children right now. I'm so completely dependent upon American systems that I would be in real trouble right now if the grocery store said, I'm done. We ain't gonna let you in no more. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about being around folks in rural, you know what I'm saying, Black America, is that a lot of those folks still had those practices.
It's the same thing. The same thing is involved. We take it to our elders. You know, I said take it to our elders, but where do we find our elders? You educate where people are, the people that you're trying to reach. You educate where they are. You know, we taking it to the young men that are in college and educating them, and they in turn are running that small groups in college where they're educating others to be able to recognize people who are getting depressed and possibly having suicidal thoughts or anything like that. But we also have had community events where we go to the churches. I've had a number of very progressive ministers and pastors who feel that it's very important for people to recognize and be able to get some help for their issues, depression, anxiety, other related family issues. So we take it to the churches. we got a young brother who is doing a national tour named Lorenzo Lewis, who is taking it to barbershops where you have African American men in barbershops talking about mental illness. You
Yeah.
take it to where our people are. That's how you continue to assess and assist people in doing better from a mental health standpoint.
I just
Uh,
realized I think it's Q&A. I don't know if I can try to moderate some of the Q&As. We've got folks that have been asking questions. Some of these go back a half an hour ago. I don't know how much time we got or who's going to cut us off, but I'm just going to try to get to some of these questions. The first one I see here is, I'm going backwards actually. What coping mechanisms can we use now during the pandemic and racial injustice for males and females? And I'm gonna expand that question as something I was thinking about earlier when you were mentioning having thousands of clients and being, restricted to the the medication part of this. What are some things that we can advise people to do to help cope with the racial injustice that we're experiencing in this moment, that are more holistic, for, if people aren't interested in medication? What are some other things that people can do besides talking to a therapist or taking medication? What are other things in terms of breathing or nutrition or movement or art and culture, specifically dealing with the racial injustice that everybody's more aware of and in some ways a lot more stressed by because of that awareness this year? Do you have tips for people like that?
well, I think obviously what you are dealing with is an enhancement of what in rural areas in the South. People that are down here have gotten more used to dealing with racial injustices and everything, and unfortunately, that's been what's going on. Whereas people in urban areas are more aware and more, I shouldn't say more progressive or anything, but more active in trying to change the differences.
Mm-hmm.
Southerners have gotten used to each other, and to a certain extent, we are just now having those conversations again. As I'm been named the chairman of a racial task force in the state of Arkansas of
Mm-hmm.
racial equity. So it's been understood for so long that we have gotten away from even trying to address those problems until now. So that's a very good question you asked, and like I said, you probably would have more answers in regard to what you guys are doing at this point in time. I think that obviously, I was taught by my parents and grandparents that, you just tell it like it is.
Mm-hmm.
Some people can't stand the truth, but the truth is the truth.
Yeah.
I've never been afraid to speak my mind, and I think that is a good thing, but it's also a curse to some people because some people can't stand the truth. So it is what it is.
Yeah. I agree with that. I do think that it's important to tell the truth, to be honest about the social political history of this place and how Black people have been impacted by it, men and women. I think a part of that telling of that story includes focusing on the parts of our story that are inspiring and powerful, and not just being beaten down and traumatized. Because as much as, they did, whoever you consider enemy did, committed crimes of humanity against our people, there's also history before that that we connect to. And so I spend a lot of time trying to reconnect and study. You mentioned elders. I feel like there's a lot of medicine in just being able to sit with elders and enter and have the connection between histories of blackness and Africanness that goes far beyond and far bigger than the momentary conflicts that we experienced in the South and in the North through racial injustice. If we look at like the power of African people globally and historically, when I study those, when I read those stories, when I look at the thousands of years that we were untouched and building civilizations, like the pride and the power in that is medicine for me. And so part of my response to it, and when I teach young people, is to start with that history. It's to not start with, I come in as a psychologist and we're talking mental health, but I begin with like, who are we as a people first, as a treatment plan? Who do we come from? What do we do? What do we contribute to the world? And then start as that as a foundation. And I think that from what my experience of most of the traditional education systems, that a lot of young people aren't getting that in schools. They might get a month, Black History Month, maybe. They might hear Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, maybe. And even those are sort of whitewashed versions of those stories. I think there's a lot of power in just telling our story from the full truth of it. Even when we talk about the traumas of us, the enslavement, I focus so much more on the resistance stories than on the lynching stories, because we got so many of those. And when we tell those stories, I see, what I'm saying, young people's backs rise up. I see the light in their eyes, because when we talk about just, we've been traumatized and the police killing us, and then Trump is, and then, the KKK, like, if you just tell that over and over again, then you feel, it's a sense of shame that you get from being Black. We've been getting our butt kicked for centuries, and now we're still getting our butt kicked. Like, why would I even want to run towards my Blackness if we losing? And I think inadvertently, by trying to tell these truths and try to address these structural issues, that we subconsciously tell our children that white is better, they've been winning, and then we wonder why they want to be like them, right? So I think that the telling of the story is important, and how we frame it. And for me, there's a lot of power in the way we tell our story about who we are, that has healing powers in that.
It's definitely how you frame it. It's definitely how you frame it. By using something you just said there, my parents framed it different for me. We're here despite everything that they've done to our African American people.
Mm-hmm.
Not, we've survived despite it. It takes a superior people to survive everything that's been done to us, and still to have achieved at a level this high. You're talking about somebody that's basically educated themselves from scratch, although, and I teach them world history. They need to know that in terms of world history, that people of color did so many more significant things before the other people that are in positions of power here, way before we even came to this world over here.
Yeah. But
we've succeeded despite,
for sure,
all the things that have been. So that my children were taught that they were superior to begin with. I can't. I've gone to classrooms, and I would wear T-shirts that represent Africa, or represent our educational superiority, and let them know that don't allow anybody to frame your life.
Yeah.
We have to continue to encourage by letting them know that the history supports our conclusions at this time.
Yeah. Okay.
It always has. It's the history they've never been taught. If we don't frame that history ourselves, and we allow somebody else to frame that history, then obviously they have success in framing the type of behaviors, attitudes, and futures of our young people.
For sure. I just glanced at the chat again. There's two themes of questions. I want to address these two sort of broad questions. One, I saw a couple different questions about access. People wanting to know in different parts of the country, how do you find a Black therapist? How do you find somebody that is talking like you talking about the importance of history and power and superiority? That's one question I'm getting. The other question I see represented in the questions is, what are the signs? What do you look for? If you see somebody that seems like they're a little bit off, what can you do? Just like person to person. If you have a loved one in your life, what are some things that we can do to respond to potential mental health signs, and what are those in people? So those are two things I just want to address before we.
Well, as I said before, you start noticing in adults, teenagers, and children, feelings, thoughts, physical effects, and spiritual beliefs. With feelings, as I gave them before, you start noticing changes in their behaviors that deal with rage, resentment, anxiety. But thoughts, difficulty concentrating or thinking, difficulty making decisions, forgetfulness, confusion, lowered self-esteem, self-blame, intrusive thoughts. Physical effects, all of a sudden you're tired, you have difficulty sleeping, your appetite is not the same. In children in particular, but also in adults, you have more physical complaints such as headaches and stomach aches.
Mm-hmm.
People don't know why they have a headache all the time, or people don't know why their stomach is unsettled, or they think they have an ulcer or something. But those could be physical effects of a person getting more depressed or more anxious and having problems. Decreased or increased sex drive,
Mm-hmm.
lightheadedness, and even weakness. Then they also have something that a lot of people in our communities deal with: spiritual beliefs. They're have a change in their thoughts about their relationship with the higher power of God.
Mm-hmm.
They abandon things that they've been taught all their life in terms of prayer, rituals, scriptures, devotions, or sacraments. They struggle with the question of what's life all about, and why does it matter? Is there fairness, and why is things not fair for me? Is there afterlife? They reject their spiritual belief providers. So there are a number of things that you start noticing about them.
And when you notice,
The
what should you
behaviors
do?
change, especially in children. Children start crying more. They're whining.
Mm-hmm.
They exhibit more temper tantrums, aggressive behaviors. They're clingy. They don't want to go to school. They will cling to their parents. They don't want to leave their parents or caregivers. They start having regressive behaviors such as thumb sucking, bedwetting, and not wanting to sleep alone. All of a sudden, they're going to come sleep with mom and dad all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is regular growth, but when they want to do it all the time and they won't do it, our daughter used to want to sleep with us until she gets mad at us, and then she go sleep in her own room. But we had to break that up. Sleep in your own room all the time.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, adults don't want to be around people anymore that they normally have been social. They don't want to go to the barbershop anymore. They let their appearance go. They start exhibiting more risky behaviors, drinking, driving erratically, speed thrills. They start becoming significantly promiscuous. They inattentive to their appearance, personal hygiene, and self-care. They start having problems at work in things that they shouldn't. They have angry outbursts. So it's a number of behaviors that happen that give you a clue that something is starting to happen. And when you first address that with somebody that you care about or that you are around all the time, you just say, "Hey, is everything okay?"
Yeah.
And sometimes people get defensive, and you say, "Well, I just noticed that, that's something new with you. You usually pretty cool, but laid back. But I noticed that something seems like it's bothering you. I'll let it go. But I'm here for you if you need to talk." And you, like I said, you just keep it simple. You give them their terms. If they want to talk about it, then they will. If they don't want to talk about it, they won't. If they get real defensive, you gotta recognize the fact that they are, and just keep your eye on it, and bring it back up at another time. But then I tell people all the time, you can always recommend, well, look, if you don't want to talk to me about it, why don't you go talk to Reverend so-and-so, or why don't you go talk to your primary care doctor about it, or why don't you seek a therapist out? You give them the opportunity to make decisions, because as long as a person is feel they can make a decision, they feel like they're still in control.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you allow them to make the decisions themselves.
That makes sense to me. How can people find you if they want to reach out for services? Do you know of any other networks? We got to wrap up now. We way over time, so we got to make any final statements.
Well, obviously, y'all have national groups. We have a Black Psychiatrists Association that's out of the National Medical Association, and usually there's a local group that is a part of the National Medical Association in terms of studying Black psychiatrists. We have the Arkansas Medical, Dental, and Pharmaceutical Association here in Arkansas, and that's our local entity of the National Medical Association. I know the Black psychologists have a Black psychologists association, and
Association
those
of Black
things are
Psychologists and social workers. There's a
yeah,
Black
and
National
Black
Black
social
Social
workers.
Workers.
You can get online. People can find anything online nowadays, and those things that give you an idea of how to get in contact with somebody that you feel would be a little bit more receptive to where you're coming from and what you're trying to do.
Perfect. And you can find me online too. I've got a website, drobaricartman.com, on Instagram, Facebook. So if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out. We're here for you. Appreciate this conversation. Appreciate this convening. And we're going to wrap this thing up. Thank y'all for your time, for paying attention, for being here. If we couldn't get to everybody's questions, again, feel free to reach out to us individually. We welcome to continue this conversation.
Indeed. Power to the people.
Power to the people.